Good afternoon. See, Miss Emily got me. She walked in and said good morning, then good afternoon, and she said, well, whatever it is. Good evening. Glad to be here. Glad to be at almost 100% capacity. You pray for each other. Pray for our services tonight. I had about 5 different directions I was going to go tonight. Just 5. And I was going to take one more week. And I was really going to do a quick synopsis of Judges, what I thought was 14, 15, something like that, on the story of Samson. The more I read, the more I realized that you have to maybe go back to Judges chapter 13, maybe even Judges chapter 12. And you all know me. You give me that many verses, and I can't summarize fast enough. And so Brother Derek was texting me, I think Monday night, about their family devotion and something that he saw on a message. And I said, well, we've been actually on Samson and talking about Samson. And I said, I may be preaching. And he was excited I was going to preach on Samson. And you pray for me. I'm going to try to put a series in about Samson. I'm learning a lot. I'm enjoying the study. My wife and I, Alyssa's been reading Samson too for her personal devotion. And you start opening up, and I would really encourage you to go in and read it, because we're going to be in it. If we don't get into an introduction of it Sunday afternoon before we do testimonies, surely the next week we will be. And so you read through. There is a lot. There's a lot of wonderful things to unpack. And I'm not talking about how wonderful Samson is. I'm talking about how wonderful our God is. So just something to think about. So you pray for me as I study. I'm looking forward to it. As we come in tonight, we'll do some of our announcements, our prayers at the end. So we'll take some time at the end. For starting today, we're starting out on the next paragraph in the church covenant. And I didn't have peace until about 2.5 hours ago, that's what we were going to do. And even going over that part of the covenant, it's really hard to break out the first sentence. When you look at, we also engage to maintain family and secret devotions, and I'm going to have one of you brethren read here in just a minute. That's a lot. That's hard to do that in one service. That's hard to do that in 2 services. So we'll see how long it takes, because it's a very crucial and important part of what we do. So if I could have one of our, well, before we do that, Brother Brian, will you lead us in a word of prayer one more time? All right. Do I have a brother that wants to start reading the church covenant for me? Go ahead, brother.
And on the profession of our faith, having been baptized in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. We do now, in the presence of God, in this assembly, most solemnly and joyfully enter into covenant with one another as one body in Christ. We engage, therefore, by the aid of the Holy Spirit, to walk together in Christian love, to strive for the advancement of this church in knowledge, holiness, and comfort, to promote its prosperity and spirituality, to sustain its worship, ordinances, discipline, and doctrines, to contribute cheerfully and regularly to the support of the ministry, the expenses of the church, the relief of the poor, and the spread of the gospel through all nations. We also engage to maintain family and secret devotions, to religiously educate our children, to seek the salvation of our kindred and acquaintances, to come circumspectly in the world, to be just in our dealings, faithful in our engagements, and exemplary in our deportment, to avoid all tattling, backbiting, and excessive anger, to abstain from the sale of and use of destructive drugs or intoxicating drinks as a beverage, to shun pornography, to be zealous in our effort to advance the kingdom of our Savior. We further engage to watch over one another in brotherly love, to remember one another in prayer, to aid one another in sickness and distress, to cultivate Christian sympathy and feeling, and Christian courtesy in speech, to be slow to take offense, but always ready for reconciliation and mindful of the rules of our Savior to secure it without delay. We moreover engage that when we remove from this place, we will as soon as possible unite with some other church where we can carry out the spirit of this covenant and the principles of God's word.
Thank you. We need to break it out a little differently today. We may not be the whole time because I just can't really go into the next part until we establish this. We engage to maintain devotion. Now, to understand devotion, you must first understand that the word devotion is only found in the scriptures one time. That's going to be at the end of the study, but that's in Acts 17 verse, I won't tell you because I don't want you going there yet. But it's in Acts 17. And I believe what our church covenant is trying to say is about us being known as being devout, devoted. Devout, here, I guess I should say it this way. What is devotion? In the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's some similarities and differences. The definition I would like to use for devout, it's a verb, to dedicate, set apart, consecrate, or appropriate by vow. Devout in the Old Testament is oftentimes used to sanctify, used in place of the word sanctify, to set apart, to be different. So when we think about we engage in devotion, we engage to be different in our worship, to be set apart in our worship, to be serious or serious-minded in our worship. In Leviticus chapter 27, we're just going to use a few passages. I want you to look at the word, not the entire context of the passage, because there's a lot going on in that passage, and I don't have time to get into it. It's talking about really essentially appraising a land or valuing a land or something like that. It is kind of the greater context of it, if I would just say it in more of a simpler term. But in Leviticus chapter 27, starting verse 21, and what it's doing is speaking of that certain field being set apart. But the field, when it goeth out in the jubile, shall be holy unto the Lord, as a field devoted, however you want to say it. The possession thereof shall be the priest. And if a man sanctify unto the Lord a field which he hath bought, which is not of the fields of his possession. And then skip down to verse 28. Notwithstanding no devoted thing that a man shall devote unto the Lord of all that he hath, both of man and beast, and of the field of his possession shall be sold or redeemed, every devoted thing is most holy unto the Lord. So we see the Lord and we see devoted in the Old Testament. We see the usage of devoting being set apart, being special. When we engage in devotion, and as we get eventually in the next week to maintaining family devotion, to maintaining secret devotion, it ought to be something that's holy to the Lord. It ought to be something that's set apart to the Lord. You know, I know my wife and I are talking about Samson this week. We really enjoyed thinking about it. We really enjoyed thinking, you know, she asked me last night, I think it was last night, I don't think it was today. She had done her personal devotion on Samson, and she said, you know, at the end where Samson asked God to, see, brother, I'm getting into Samson, I didn't even know it. But when Samson asked God to avenge him of his eyes and give him strength one more time, you know, she was like, was that him being vain? Was that him being vain for his wanting to avenge? And I said, no, that's why you got to go back to Judges chapter 13. Because in Judges chapter 13, when Samson's mother was visited by the angel, that angel said, for he will begin to judge the Philistines. And where that's all, I'm not going any farther. I'm not spoiling the fun. It's a really interesting study. But even in Samson, he was set apart. He was devout. And we were thinking about our study, and we're thinking about just how much we've enjoyed listening to the words that we read, rereading those things, thinking on those things, dwelling on those things. Is our study devout? Are we spending time? You know, Samson's an interesting story for kids and adults alike because he's a big, strong man. He killed 1,000 people with a jawbone of a donkey, you know. I mean, the Lord gave him strength. And so you can captivate an audience or captivate kids while you read that, but there's so much more to think about. That's just one part of the living word, though. That's just such a small part for us to learn. So you think about that, then go to Numbers chapter 18. In Leviticus, it was speaking of that field or that of a field being set apart, being sanctified, being for the Lord. That should be how our devotion should be. It should be set apart. In Numbers chapter 18, verse 13, I think it was, make sure I wrote this down right. Yeah. Verse 13, whatsoever is first ripe in the land which they shall bring unto the Lord shall be thine. Every one that is clean in thine house shall eat of it. Everything devoted in Israel shall be thine. In the Old Testament, there was a need to devote some of the spoil, some of the goods, some of the fields. Talking about the Mosaic Law and talking about the law in Leviticus. And we're not here to learn about that today. We're here to learn about the term devoted and the seriousness of it. In the Old Testament, when you see devote, devoted, devout, it's used to talk about something being set apart. Now, let's talk about the New Testament. Interestingly enough, 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's see, how many do I have? 5, 6, 7 of my 8 passages in the New Testament. Where do you think they're found? Acts. The book of Acts. Go to Acts chapter 2. Just when you thought we were going to be getting out of Acts chapter 2, here we are again. Verse 5 of Acts chapter 2, this is speaking about the term of devout in the New Testament, and it gets different. It gets much different. In the New Testament, really, in my mind, it talks about, I've got to be careful, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but the variances of devout and how people can be mentioned as being devout. I'll stop there because I keep wanting to get ahead of myself. But in verse 5, and there were dwelling at Jerusalem Jews, devout men out of every nation under heaven. So, we're trying to figure out this word devotion, where it came from, the origins of it. I've heard people talk about, I've heard studies on this preached before, and they're preached much differently than, frankly, than I believe. When you look at this word devout, it's being set apart. We are engaging to set apart our family studies. What does that mean? We are engaging to set apart our personal studies. We're going to keep going. These devout men in Acts chapter 2, verse 5, these were men that were well known for following after God. Now, these were Jews. We know what these Jews have done. I don't have to rehash it. But that's what they were known for. You might say that a Catholic priest is devout or pious because they're devout to the religion. In the New Testament, devout can be used a little bit differently. Doesn't necessarily mean it's unto the Lord. You know, I was thinking about my family and thinking about me and my leadership and shamefully thinking about, I keep wanting to get ahead of myself, but I'll give you the start because I'm already there. What am I devoting my time to? And one of my favorite ways to rest and relax, I only have two. When it comes to Sundays, when I get home, I get my weekend for those few hours that we get home, and my wife does too. This time of year, we love to watch football. If the Lions are playing, our whole family sits around and watches the Lions play. And it started coming into frame of mind, is that what devout means? Am I devout to not miss a football game? Am I devout to sit in front of the TV and make a point to watch that football game? 32 weeks out of the year, there's dirt bike racing. You all laugh at me, that's fine, I don't care, but 32 weeks out of the year, I watch dirt bike racing. And oftentimes it's on Sunday evening when I get home. What am I devout to? You think about these Jews, these devout men, these men that now, remember, they traveled into Jerusalem for the Passover feast from all over, right? They had to travel. They had to engage to get there. That's how when the Holy Spirit came down and the speaking in tongues gave utterance, because all of them were there and they spoke in their native languages. They came from a distance. There's a lot of football fans on Sunday night that are devout to be in a stadium somewhere. Devout can be used differently. So what are you devoting your time to? When we see we also engage to maintain family in secret devotions, we engage to be devout. That means we have to put some work in. These men were set apart. They were different. These devout Jews were different. Now they were wrong, we know their cause, we know their charge, but they were different. Their life was different. In Acts chapter 8, I want to show you two types of devout men in Acts chapter 8. Pick up in verse 1. And Saul was consenting unto his death. And at that time there was a great persecution against the church, which was at Jerusalem. And they were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. And devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him. There's two types of devout men. There's two types of devotion. You have Saul, devout and devoted to killing these ones that spoke Jesus. And then you had the ones who grabbed Stephen's body and buried it and cried and wept over him. You can be devout to many things tonight. Before we get in to speaking about being devout, being devoted in our Bible study, personally, as a family, you have to understand what you're devoted to. Where is your devotion? What's your level of devotion? What's your level of devotion to reading the Bible? There's so much to be learned. Look at the two different effects of devout men. Look at Saul, and look at the pallbearers, I'll say. The one that stoned him, the one that picked him up. Sometimes you can be devout and still be devoted to sin. Here we go again. I'm thinking about Samson. Samson was devoted to his own sin. He was devoted. He thought he had a wife. That didn't work. He went after 3 different women, and that's exactly what ended up killing him. But that's what he was devoted to. Women and killing people. That was Samson. That's what he was devoted to. Devout doesn't always mean a great thing. And there's a lot of us that may represent a different level of devotion that's not to family and secret devotion. Could be to this world. Could be to our hobbies. Could be to the things we like. Could be to our feelings. Could be to our wants. There's many, many, many people today living devout for a religion that's not godly. Go to Acts chapter 10. Verse 2. Well, go to verse 1. We'll read both verses. There was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius, a centurion of the band called the Italian band, a devout man, and one that feared God with all his house, which gave much alms to the people and prayed to God always. Now, there's a lot of debate about Cornelius. There's a lot of debate about was he saved, was he not. There's some things in verse 14 that they say, hey, he wasn't saved. I'm sorry, not verse 14, but I'm not going to go into that yet because we're in the book of Acts. We're going to get time to get there. But we see that he prayed, he was devout. There's even a conversation on whether or not he was saved or not. Was he just devout to religion or was he devout to God? There's people that say they fear God and they're devout towards God and they don't have any salvation today. Devout can be used to describe deeply religious people in the New Testament. That doesn't mean they're saved. And we're going to get to another passage in a second. There's a lot of people that fear God on a moral basis. In Acts chapter 22, verse 12, we see a different usage of a person being devout, and this is Ananias. Now, of course, this is Paul retelling his testimony of being saved on the road to Damascus and meeting with Ananias, and Ananias giving him sight. and talking about him being devout. But in verse 12, and one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, having a good report of all the Jews which dwelt there. Some of you may be wondering where I'm going with this. And I'm almost there. Stay with me. Ananias was a man of good testimony. He was a man of even being well known amongst the Jews. Go to Proverbs chapter 22. I read this passage once a month to my children. Once every other month. To Leo and Ophelia, it should be in their memory. But in Proverbs chapter 22, verse 1, it says, a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver and gold. Now, I've really confused you all because we just went from Acts and talking about devout men to Proverbs about a good name. But the point of what I'm saying is our study ought to be known. If you look at all of these passages talking about devout men, the study would be known. The devotion would be known. Go to Acts chapter 13. We see that in Acts chapter 13, towards the end, pick up in verse 50. Pick up in verse 49 for context. And the word of the Lord was published throughout all the region. But the Jews stirred up the devout and honorable women and the chief men of the city, and raised persecution against Paul and Barnabas, and expelled them from out of their coasts. But they shook off the dust off their feet against them, and came unto Iconium. And the disciples were filled with joy and with the Holy Ghost. They were devout men, devoted to preaching the gospel. They had devout and honorable men and women push them out. So you can be devoted to something but not be devoted to the right thing. And before we start talking about being devoted to secret devotion, private devotion, family devotion, I think we need to start by looking at what are we devoted to? What are we given to? What is our time given to? What is our excuse given to? Acts chapter 17. And verse 4. Yeah, we'll pick up in verse 4. And some of them believed and consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks a great multitude, and of the chief women not a few. Go over to verse 17 of chapter 17. Therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews and with the devout persons, and in the market daily with them that met with him. And just to move in to bring these points together, go to verse 22. This would be known as Paul's sermon on Mars Hill. Paul preaching again here. Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, Ye men of Athens. Sounds familiar. He's addressing them again. I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, there's the only time that word is used in the Bible. I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you. Chapter 17 is talking to the Greeks, the Athenians, a very, very idolatrous people. But you know what it says early in the chapter? When you go back to verse 4, what's the word used? And some of them believed and consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks a great multitude, and of the chief women not a few. And like I said, you go back to 17. Therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews and with the devout persons, and in the market daily with them that met with him. The Athenians, the Greeks, they were known not for being Jewish, for being idolaters. At this time, as Paul walked into Athens, there was more idols than there was people. And you think about verse 23, where we get the word devotion, where it comes back into play. This is the inscription to the unknown God. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, Paul could see what they were devoted to. That's why we've spent all this time talking about devout, devoted. Why we read a Proverbs about a good name. As Paul walked by, he could see what the Athenians were devoted to. He could see their devotions. So before we spend time talking about family devotion, secret devotion, personal devotion, public devotion, devotionals, Bible studies, anything of that nature, what does your devotions look like? What are you devoted to? Where's your time spent? Do we have a bunch of false gods in our home? Do we have a bunch of false distractions? Is your work a distraction? Is the TV a distraction? Is your cell phone a distraction? My wife and I were reading she read me a study done by Focus on the Family, a couple different studies. And you know what? One of the biggest problems in this world today is that nobody can take this thing right here and throw it somewhere and not check it. Not leave it alone. Believe me, I come from the car business. Nobody gets more mad than when their car breaks down that you just sold it to them. And I had plenty of salesmen that didn't want to take care of it. I felt like I always had to have my phone on me. And we make excuses. Why we got to take care of this, why we got to take care of that, when all reality we really don't. I had a conversation with a non-Christian the other day, somebody that I don't believe claims to be a Christian in any capacity, and he said, getting rid of my social media was the most freeing experience I've ever had in my life. I am not preaching on you guys against social media. Quite frankly, I don't care. Y'all do what you want to do. I'm really not. Don't sit out there and get defensive. There goes Pastor again. He's saying, get rid of social media, get rid of this. I'm telling you, if you can't take that thing and set it down for 2 hours, you got a problem. That's one of the biggest problems in this country today. That's what we're devoted to. Sports, TV, money. We can't even talk about being devoted to family and secret devotion because we're not ready to realize what we're devoted to. if the Lord was to walk in your home right now, I want you to think about Acts chapter 17, verse 23. I really want you to think about it. If the Lord was to walk into your home right now, do you have an inscription to the unknown God invisibly written in your home? It's made me think of some things. It's made me think of some things I need to change. I'll tell you, I was addicted to my cell phone 8 months ago. Notification anxiety, as my wife so loves to call it, and I'm not picking on her. I love how she says it. FOMO, fear of missing out. I feel wonderful. I've never felt better. I get to come home and feel like I'm part of my house, part of my home. I'm not saying it in pride that I feel like I'm living up to the responsibilities I need to, but I'm thankful. Before we get on family devotion, what are you devoted to? What is your time going to? Devotion, in summary to what I just said, devotion is any time where we set apart special time for something else. There's nothing wrong with having hobbies, and I'm not preaching against it. I'm not. Believe me, if I didn't mess my forks up on my dirt bike, we've had plenty of good days. I'd be out riding my dirt bike once a month or twice a month if I could. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having hobbies, and I encourage that in moderation. We can be devoted to anything. Are we serving God with our devotion? Are we serving ourselves with our devotion? We're going to end on that tonight before we get into announcements.